Hello, my name is Terran Williams, and the title of my presentation is Priscilla and the Explosion of Women Church Planters Today. I'm Terran Williams. I film myself from Cape Town, South Africa. I am part-time a leader of a church in the middle of the city of Cape Town called Signal Church, and I'm also a part-time author. One of my books is How God Sees Women, The End of Patriarchy. And I'm answering the question, does the Spirit of God regard gender when he chooses people to plant, care for, and lead churches? And although my book deals with the question in full, I want to provide some evidence that leans in the direction of no, the Spirit does not discriminate with regard to gender when he's choosing people to lead and to pioneer and to teach churches. In the Tell Her Story conference, one of the points that is made is that those in power get to rewrite history. And unfortunately, since mostly churches have been led by men, it's remarkable how many stories of women who play significant leadership roles have been erased from history, thankfully not from the scriptures. So what I would like to do is I want to, in this workshop, tell you some hopefully riveting stories of firstly female church planters in the Middle East today and in Asia and in Africa. I mean, these are people, if they weren't doing the work they were doing, it would significantly undermine the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Then I'd like to lean into just a tiny bit of the evidence on Priscilla as somebody who provides biblical precedent. In other words, a woman who also planted and cared for and taught churches. And then, because I live in Cape Town, I have dug into some of my own history of the church and found two women that are almost all but forgotten, even in my local history, who led and taught and were used significantly by God to both men and women in the local church. And then finally, I want to speak about the Great Commission, and I want to recommend that it should be the Great Commission of Matthew 28, not a misinterpretation of 1 Timothy 2 verse 12, that is the hermeneutical key in answering the question, does the Spirit of God use both men and women to lead and to plant and to teach churches today? First, let me tell you about the Middle East. The Middle East, obviously a Muslim context predominantly. You might have heard about the Iranian revival that has recently, like the last few decades, seen over 100,000 people converting to Jesus, being evangelized and discipled and brought into these vibrant underground churches that I think are reminiscent of the first century churches, which also tended to be small, underground, if we can say it like that, in the Roman Empire. Well, they met in homes at least, more organic, that relied heavily on anointed individuals to do the work. Well, I have a friend called Dr. Katia Adams who planted out of South Africa a few years ago into Boston, US, has planted a church called Table. Well, remarkably, it's her parents and her grandparents that have been at the forefront of this Iranian revival. So I asked her to make an inquiry. How many of these churches, these underground churches, have got women in significant roles? Well, it turns out that 50% of all of these underground churches that are evangelizing both men and women, discipling them, bringing them into community, basically leading churches, half of all of these underground churches are led by women. It teaches me a lesson, to be honest. When I first wrote my book, How God Sees Women, I made the point that probably in stridently patriarchal cultures like Muslim ones, it would be better to only release men into leadership. To be honest, I was going beyond my level of knowledge. I hadn't done research. In reality, wherever there is an underground church that relies heavily on anointed workers, both men and women, regardless of how patriarchal that context, can thrive in the work of evangelizing both men and women and discipling them in community. Moving from the Middle East to Asia, another friend of mine who I had the privilege of writing a theological paper with recently is Dr. Leslie Segraves. She's a mission leader of the Serving Shoulder to Shoulder ministry, and she told me what's happening in Asia. So in South Asia, a movement recently of about 4,000 women were equipped as disciple makers, and they've planted churches, listen to this, in no less than 20,000 villages. And they carry a strong emphasis on multiplication, so that many of the house churches they've planted have multiplied and reached up to the 12th generation of church plants. In other words, these women are having a remarkable impact. And then moving to Southeast Asia, beginning during the COVID crackdown, a movement of about 2,000 or more women equipped as leaders in the disciple-making movement have led thousands to Christ. So South Asia, Southeast Asia. Leslie also tells me about the tens of millions in China reached for Christ in the last half century, which is something we rejoice in as the global church. The story is well known. Men and women have been propelled by the Spirit to oversee house churches consisting of their converts. Well, I don't know if you know that more than half of these churches have been led by women. Leslie's face turns sad as she explains that some of China's church growth has begun to slow down. And a chief reason, she explains, is that outsiders have entered in and brought increased church policy, which has restricted women from joining their brothers in leadership. Leslie tells me of some leading Chinese women who have lamented to her. They say, we've given our blood for Christ in our nation, but now foreign books and outside theology have entered in and taught women that they should not lead. We want to obey Christ. We want to make an impact, but now we no longer know who we are. So moving on from Asia, let's not forget Africa. I mean, headlines about religion may be focused on the words and actions of Western male leaders, but the reality of the worldwide church is quite different. Says one missiologist, more and more Christians live outside Europe and North America, especially in Africa. I've heard somebody say that in 2050, if there's one human face that will be chosen to represent the Christian majority, it will be a young African woman. And yet the statistics actually show that to be inaccurate, because already now, 2024, the fastest growing section of the church is sub-Saharan Africa, where women are thriving, and probably the face that best represents Christianity in the world already now is a young African woman. And I can tell you, as somebody living in Africa, that the Spirit of God is upon both men and women. For example, my longtime friend Paul Van Coller planted Hope Church in Mongu, Zambia. And it's since grown to be the largest in the region. And God gave this church a vision to plant churches all over Zambia. We're talking about churches that are numbering into the hundreds and hundreds of churches. Well, anyway, when Paul and his leadership team prayed for workers for the harvest field, they did not expect whom the Lord of the harvest would send. Not only men, but many women also. You know the story in Acts chapter 16 where Paul has a vision and he's called to Macedonia by the man of Macedonia, only to find out that the man is a woman who would open the door for the church plant into Europe. Well, Paul Van Coller had the same experiences. Many women began to arrive at this church in Mongu, being told that the Spirit of God had called them, and they'd walked for days. Many of them had literally limped all the way there because their bodies were broken across croc-infested rivers to receive the gospel, to receive training, and went back to their villages to plant churches. Well, when they got to these villages, there was some resistance because they're women. In animistic African cultures, women are not just inferior to men, they are property of men. But as these women stuck at it, the men began to notice the Spirit of God empowering these women, and especially these women brought men onto their leadership teams. It's amazing how men took to these churches. And these women have done remarkably. I asked Paul for the names of many of these women. And in his first report to me, he told me the story of Musa in the Kasheke church. She was trained in the gospel, and she has planted something like 4 generations of churches, not only leading a church, but now 20 churches under her leadership. So the next time Paul went on a field trip to the churches, I asked him to take a photo for me. Well, he went to a different part of this Hope Church, and he sent back this beautiful picture of Monica, Charity, and Phoebe from the Matete area in western Zambia. Now, this is a place where men are terrified of witchcraft, and alcoholism is rife. But these three women defied those terrors, faced these croc-infested rivers, and planted the first church in the area. And they worked hard to do this, and amazingly, they have planted church after church. So something like 40 churches are now under their leadership. You know, you read the book of Acts and you look at Paul and Barnabas and Timothy, and you wonder what they might look like in the 21st century. So take a look at these three women, and I propose this is what Paul and Timothy and Silas looked like in the 21st century, where the Spirit of God powerfully moves across Africa, where by the year 2050, 10 billion people on planet Earth, of which a quarter of them will come just from Africa. The predominant move of God in the world, missionally speaking, is Africa. We should pray for these women. Very encouraging stuff. So we're still telling her story, and I've spoken about these women church planters all around the world, in Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the pushback could be, well, that's interesting, but practice should not drive our theology. Our theology should drive our practice. And besides, there is no biblical precedent for women church planters who gathered their converts and cared for as pastors and taught their converts apostolic doctrine. And my pushback is, yes, there was. There's Priscilla in the New Testament. And although the references to Priscilla are scattered across the scriptures, the book of Acts, the writings and letters of Paul, if you piece all of that together, we actually know quite a lot about Priscilla. In a video 2 years ago for the CBE International Conference, I did a teaching on why Pastor Priscilla ends Christian patriarchy. And if you want to watch this 46-minute teaching, please search for that in Google, why Pastor Priscilla ends Christian patriarchy. There, I deal with the matter more fully. If I can just say a couple things off the top of my mind that give you a taste of Priscilla. So most egalitarian theologians that I've read argue that Priscilla taught theology to a man, Apollos, and that's absolutely correct. But when you piece all of the biblical data together, we can say that she didn't just teach in an isolated manner a man, but that actually this was part of a larger ministry of what I'd describe as pastor teachering. So you might know the story. Paul goes to Corinth. There he meets Priscilla and Aquila, who open their home to him. They're tent makers like he is. They probably were Christians before in the Roman church, got kicked out, or they come to faith under Paul. But for a year and a half, they really get behind Paul, so much so that when he embarks a year and a half later towards Syria via Ephesus, he takes not Timothy and Silas with him, but he opts to take Priscilla and Aquila. He lands in Ephesus, preaches the gospel on the Sabbath. It seems like there is an immediate response because it speaks about people that want him to stay. He tells them he'd like to come back, but he can't guarantee it. And then it tells us that he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there. They don't say, let us do it. Paul directs them to it. They're under apostolic direction. And what do they do there? Well, Acts chapter 18, verse 27 speaks about some brothers and sisters in the city of Corinth that are evidently these new converts that are under their care. And we read in the verse before that Apollos, who has come upon some Christian doctrine and yet has got some big gaps in his understanding, is trying to take his partial understanding of the gospel to the Jews in the synagogue. Priscilla and Aquila welcome him in. There's some debate about the translation. Does he just take them aside and have a quick chat? Or do they take him in, welcome him into their lives, into their home, into their even doctrine? I'd opt for the latter. You can watch the video for why I make that argument. And they take him in and they teach him the way of God more accurately. And we're told that Priscilla, her name is mentioned first, which is the case for most of the time. The 6 places where Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned, her name is mentioned first. In ancient tradition, men's name was always mentioned first. When we first hear of Aquila and Priscilla, his name is mentioned first, which probably is the customary way of doing things. But we remember that Luke, when it comes to putting the most prominent person in a group, he tends to put their name first. Peter's name is always mentioned first in the Gospel of Luke. And Barnabas' name is always mentioned before Paul's, up until Paul takes leadership as they hit the missionary road, being planted out of the Antioch church, after which every time it's Paul's name that is mentioned first. So the fact that Priscilla's name is mentioned before Aquila is probably a sign that her ministry was more obvious. Maybe she was more publicly gifted in her teaching or in her leadership gifts. In this church, Priscilla and Aquila stay in the Ephesian church for at least 2 to 3 years. We know Paul comes back, and of course things really pick up when he comes back. There's a revival, there's also persecution. Near the end of his tenure in the Ephesian church, he writes a letter to the Corinthian church, sending greetings from Priscilla and Aquila, who have a church meeting in their house. So Priscilla and Aquila cared for that body of believers. What else do we know about that body of believers in Acts 18, verse 27? Well, in Acts chapter 20, there's a tantalizing detail when Paul calls the elders of the Ephesian church together, by which time Priscilla and Aquila have already gone to the Roman church. But he says to them that they knew his way of life from the first day he set foot in Asia, pointing back to the time when he first came to Ephesus and got that first initial harvest. In other words, Priscilla and Aquila were not just pastoring a bunch of brothers and sisters. Priscilla and Aquila were leaders making more leaders, in fact, future elders in the church. I mean, what we're doing here is we're recognizing the amazing work that Priscilla and Aquila did. Then, after probably about 2 to 3 years, they move up to the Roman church. When Paul writes to the Roman church, he mentions 27 people in Romans 16. The first person he greets is Priscilla, and then Aquila. Mentions her name first. He commends them as fellow workers. We've got to ask why he puts their name first. Again, he's lending recognition to the prominent role that they played. He says they were co-workers. They risked their lives for me. The reason they risked their lives for Jesus and for Paul is because publicly they stood with Paul. They were not just, members on the side, quietly attending meetings. They must have played a public role. Their fame had spread to churches beyond, we're told, in Romans chapter 16, verses 3 to 4. And then years later, Paul writes to the Ephesian church, the second letter to Timothy, and Priscilla and Aquila, after many years in the Roman church, have relocated back to Ephesus. And they're obviously helping sort out a difficult situation there, where according to the first letter written to 1 Timothy, there were many women who had gone awry. Thank goodness Priscilla and Aquila arrived to the church that they helped to plant in Ephesus, that they helped to initially disciple and care for. And another question is, why the book of Acts even mentions that detail of Priscilla and Aquila? You might know that from Acts 16 to the end, the emphasis is entirely on the ministry of Paul. There's one deviation. It's when Paul leaves Ephesus, and yet Luke still finds that he needs to do some focus on what's happening in Ephesus in Paul's absence. And if we remember that the entire section is about Paul's ministry, second half of the book of Acts, we're to ask why that is. And there is some internal evidence in the New Testament that the early churches began to see Apollos as Paul's rival. See, Apollos is Paul's rival. Well, what Luke shows in his detailed story is that it's Priscilla and Aquila who've been authorized by Paul to enforce that doctrinal teaching, so that the training they've received, they pass on to Apollos. Luke is making it clear that Apollos has been trained by Paul's trainees. He's not Paul's rival, he's Paul's disciple. So he shouldn't be seen as being in any way incompatible with Paul. But if you pull together this little bit of data, what you've got are a couple that helped plant a church. They were tried and tested under Paul's training. He selected them for a missionary task. They weren't just itinerant. They didn't move from place to place. They stayed in a place for several years, which makes them more like a pastor-teacher role. And they cared for a community of believers. They were authoritative in their teaching. Complementarians emphasize, according to their interpretation of 1 Timothy 2 verse 12, that a woman shouldn't teach with authority. I don't know of a more authoritative kind of teaching than training theologically one of the great teachers of the churches in a corrective manner, like they did to Apollos. And then by the time they go to the Roman church, by the looks of it, they're playing a prominent role there because they have a house church again, not only like they did in Ephesus and probably in Corinth, but now in Rome. Fascinatingly, there are three places where Paul emphasizes spiritual gifts as the determinant for who does what in local church. They are the letters to the Corinth, in the 1 Corinthians, the Romans, in the letter to the Romans, and also the letter to the Ephesians. Well, it turns out that Priscilla had been involved in all three of those churches. And the evidence seems to show from her that she had been liberated and freed up to use the gifts that God had given her. Evidently, pastoral gifts, perhaps leadership gifts, teaching gifts. And all of this, I'm trying to make the point, although the Bible doesn't say Priscilla, the pastor teacher, that actually these are the functions ascribed to her. People argue, well, it doesn't say that she was a pastor teacher. The counter argument is it doesn't say that about anyone anywhere. We have no named pastor teachers with the exception of Peter, who was an elder in a local church. He describes himself as a fellow elder. John, also writing to a church, speaks himself as an elder, but probably it refers not to his role, but to his age. For whatever reason, the New Testament doesn't like to slap on labels when it's describing functions. Ephesians 4, which speaks about the fivefold ministry, including pastor and teacher, there's nothing in that passage to suggest that it excludes women. And I propose that Priscilla and Aquila are some of the finest examples we have in the New Testament of people that planted churches, cared for disciples, gathered them into community, and taught and trained them in apostolic doctrine. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you pastor teacher Priscilla Aquila, who is a front runner of the many amazing women that I've been describing to you in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. And I'm not even thinking of the roughly 30,000 churches in the US that are led, evangelical churches that are led by women clergy. So we are busy telling her story, and because I live in Cape Town, South Africa, I thought my international friends might appreciate a local story. And I have a friend who is involved in reconciliation work, where churches visit some of the wounds of the past and try to bring what sometimes is centuries long of wounding that needs reconciliation. And he was called to get involved in an interdenominational reconciliation between the Dutch Reformed Church and the Moravian Church in Cape Town. So what had happened is that the early European settlers that came to South Africa, they set up the Dutch Reformed Church, which basically dominated. And in 1737, the German Moravian Church sent a missionary called George Smith, who set up a mission station, a church, and taught people and converted people. And in 1744, after he had baptized in water 5 adults, the Dutch Reformed Church leaders became threatened by him, and they used their political powers to evict him from Cape Town. Heartbreaking situation, this beautiful community that had taken off in the Western Cape of Cape Town. It's the region of South Africa I come from, and their leader is gone. Well, so he was basically involved in the Dutch Reformed Church and the Moravian Church, and the Dutch Reformed Church was extending apology, the Moravian Church was extending forgiveness, reconciliation. But fascinatingly, as he got involved in this case, the Moravian Church said, we've got some of our own wounding of ourselves, and we would like you to deal with 2 wounds. The first one is an intergender wound. Because here's the fascinating thing. If you do a cursory study on the history of the Moravian Church in South Africa, you know that George Smith gets deported from Western Cape. And then you're told he goes in 1744, and you're told in the 1790s, 3 more German Moravian missionaries arrive in Cape Town, and they re-establish George Smith's work. Heroes to come save the day. But here's the problem. What these history reports do is they neglect another story. George Smith has got an early convert in a Griqua woman called Magdalena. He gives her a New Testament, teaches her how to read, disciples her. When George Smith is deported, Magdalena takes over the teaching and leading functions of this particular community. So that when the others come back, decades later, she's still an old woman there, and she's managed to hold this community together. So that is the gender reconciliation that needs to take place. Why was the story of this woman deleted from the history books of this denomination? Which leads to a third wound that my friend needed to deal with, because as you do further, deeper study into what happened when George Smith left, is that in fact he hadn't only trained up one woman, he'd trained up two women who continued his pastoral and his teaching role with these believers. There was a Griqua woman who was a mixed race woman, Magdalena, but there was also an indigenous Khoikhoi woman called Martha. And what had happened is there'd been a stratification of races, white, mixed race or Griqua, and Khoikhoi, the indigenous, were right at the bottom. So the wounding in this denomination had basically been to erase from its memory not only women, but when a woman was mentioned, the women of the lowest status in that racist scheme, a Khoikhoi woman. So there needed to be some racial healing as well. I tell that story. It's fascinating. We need to tell these stories. Let me tell you about another woman in the Western Cape, Cape Town area where I live, that is forgotten by church history. In fact, so forgotten that I only found out about her last week. So most regions in the world where there is a vibrant presence of Christianity, there usually are some revivals in the history, an outbreak of faith, an outpouring of the Spirit, vibrant gospel sharing that leads to the conversion of many people. And the Western Cape, we have our story. In the 1860s, there was a revival that broke out that ended up being a multiracial revival, because it started off with farm workers and then spread to farms, spread across the Western Cape. And in fact, the Cape Revival from the 1860s is actually known quite well as Andrew Murray's revival. Andrew Murray was the local pastor who's written some of the most famous devotionals in the world. Abide in Christ, With Christ in the School of Prayer. You may have heard of it, and you may have thought, if you've done some research, that he was the one who spearheaded the revival. And it's true that he came into leadership in this revival that saw so many people coming to faith and coming on fire for God in the Western Cape, and we feel the effects of this revival to this day. But last week I discovered how the revival started. Well, it turns out there was one particular farm, and the farm workers had been slaves up until the 1830s in this farm, and because they were slaves, they had to go to church. Well, once the British arrived in the Western Cape and put an end to the keeping of slaves, they still remained farm workers, but they were no longer slaves. They had some more liberties, and they stopped coming to church. The farm owner, Opa Norde, Granddad Norde in the story, still wanted these farm workers to come, but he, for some reason, thought that he needed to speak High Dutch, because that was the language worthy of God, even though he struggled to speak High Dutch. So he'd invite these largely uneducated farm workers and speak to them in a language like Shakespearean Dutch. And they couldn't understand it. They didn't have to come. They didn't want to come. Well, when his granddaughter, Catharina van Blurk, a teenage girl of 16 years old, used to visit him on the farm, she noticed that these farm workers were not going to church, and they'd basically given up on their faith. They'd kind of a memory of faith. And she carried such a burden about this that she took to praying intensely for a week. I think fasting, praying that God would get hold of the farm workers on this farm. And she basically tells the story that she had a bit of influence with her granddad, and she took over the meeting. And she used to meet on a Monday night with these farm workers, and she carried such a burden, and she really believed that God was going to get a hold of them. So she used a bit of advertising. She walked around and said, please come on Monday night, because I'm going to tell you a story. And when they arrived, she told them the story of Jonah, the story of when the captain comes to him and he says, hey, why are you sleeping? Why don't you call on your God? And she tells the story, and then she says she starts to preach some points, preaches it like a sermon. She had heard her pastor, Andrew Murray, preaching a sermon on this topic. So she starts preaching too. Well, as she's preaching, suddenly there's a loud rumbling noise. She stops. Everybody starts looking out the windows. What's going on? It sounds like there's a train approaching the room. The rumbling gets louder and louder. She's wondering, what is this terrible noise on our way? Suddenly the room starts to shake, And then upon the instant, the farm workers who are gathered, this many that she managed to recruit to the room, there is such a powerful outpouring of the Spirit that they take to weeping for hours and days on end. And so begins the revival. The weeping soon enough gives way to joy. Conviction gives way to assurance of salvation. And the Cape Revival is underway thanks to a teenage girl who took over an outreach meeting and took upon herself to try teach the scriptures as best as she could. If ever there's an example of a woman whose preaching came under the power of the Spirit, I'd put to you Katharina van Blurk as one of those beautiful examples. Let me pull all of these threads together. Can a woman teach and preach and plant a church and care for those that she gathers, discipling converts, gathering them into a community, play a pastor-teacher role? Well, that certainly is happening today, and I propose that it happened already in New Testament times. Priscilla is one such example. And I want to make a plea, especially to the American church that is at the forefront of sending missionaries. As a person in Africa, I'm so grateful to the global passion that so many American churches have, investing workers and money and a passion for the world and its mission. So we receive all of your work, but I also want to make a plea to you to be less dogmatic in your interpretations of 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. I think that you've misinterpreted that passage. I think a more careful study of 1 Timothy 2 suggests that Paul is addressing a very local situation. A careful study of the word authentio, that is often translated as exercise authority in the ESV, which puts it as, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority. I think that's a mistranslation. In the time around Paul, we have no extra biblical use at all where it meant that. I recognize that Al Walters has done a lot of work that puts that case forward. Andrew Bartlett and I, in engaging Mike Winger, who has presented Al Walters' work, I think have decisively answered many of those claims. That is not the word Paul used in 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. It doesn't mean exercise authority. If, as complementarians say, Paul is looking for two actions that are typical of a pastor, namely teaching or exercising authority, he would never have used that word authenteo when he had other words that were perfectly good to go that he did use for pastoral leadership. And as difficult as it is to translate 1 Timothy 2, I think that we need to just acknowledge that it's a difficult to translate passage and that there's plenty of indicators that a local situation is being addressed. And especially we should look at women today not through a mistranslation or interpretation of 1 Timothy 2 verse 12, but through the Great Commission, where Jesus was emphatic that the whole church, not just the apostles, because Jesus says, I will be with you till the end, referring to us. Every believer is commissioned to go and make disciples, evangelizing people, and not just to evangelize them, but to disciple them, to teach them to obey everything. The women that I've referred to, none of them are competing with men. Katharina van Blurk was not competing with men. The women in Africa are not competing with men. They have the Spirit of God on them like so many of their brothers do. A passion for the Great Commission comes upon them. A passion for planting churches, for caring for their converts. It's the Spirit of God, not feminism, that is behind this trend. And I think about the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. There was a theological question: what to do with these Gentile converts? And really it was a question of how to interpret the scriptures, because many early believers interpreted the scriptures as insisting that these Gentile believers needed to effectively become Jews. They could have even referred to the teachings of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, where he says he's not come to abolish the law of Moses, and Matthew chapter 10, and then again in 15, where he says the focus of his work is on Israel. And yet here are these Gentiles, what to do with them? Well, in their attempt to try reach a theologically correct interpretation of the various scriptures on the matter, they admitted in Acts 15 as evidence what the Spirit of God was doing. And Peter shared his story, as did Paul and Barnabas, of how the Spirit of God was coming upon gathered Gentiles. And without any commitment to the law of Moses, we're coming into the full liberty of the presence of the Spirit. And I want to propose that that although that there are conflicting interpretations of what to do with 1 Timothy 2, and we should admit into this conversation what the Spirit of God is doing around the world. And I want to make a plea to complementarian friends in local churches around the world that have an influence to be very careful that you don't damage the advance of the Great Commission being fulfilled in our generation. In 1980, there was only 1 billion people that didn't have access to the gospel. That number has doubled to 2.1 billion people. And we so desperately need both men and women who have gifts of evangelism, gifts of teaching, gifts of pastoring, gifts of leadership. We need everybody to deploy those gifts. Sending so much love to my friends all over the world and in America. And I'm just rejoicing as a brother in Christ that it's not just me who gets to plant churches and teach churches and gather communities around the gospel, but my sisters are right there in the front lines with me, and I bless your work. Sending so much love.